a couple of little musical selections that are part of this presentation. This first one is a traditional Scottish tune called The Soldier's Return. Just a little bit of this, and then it has a little story to it as well, and it does relate to all this too. That was The Soldier's Return. That was an arrangement written by Mauro Giuliani. Mauro Giuliani was an Italian guitarist, composer, he was also a multi-instrumentalist. He played cello in the orchestra that premiered Beethoven's Third Symphony. And actually Beethoven is rumored to have said, to have heard Giuliani play guitar and said, oh, it's like an orchestra in a box. So there you go, orchestra in a box. There's another piece that should be going to run here. Have it. If I have my druthers, I would play more here to find it. Of course, I had all this bookmarked, of course, and the bookmark fell. We can skip that for right now. Alright, so enough of that for right now, I think. So why am I playing a Italian composer's version of a traditional Scottish folk song that was known in Scots time, by the way, and that was composed around that time as well. One second while I put this. Now we can get to this. So, Sir Walter Scott, right? He was, basic information, right? Born 1771, lived to 1832. Born in Edinburgh. He, in 1820, he was knighted and given a baronetcy. It was one of his titles is First Baronet. He was a Fellowship of the Royal Society of Edinburgh and an FSA Scot, as many of us here are also. I think I still have that. I've paid my dues, but he's known as a historical novelist, a poet, an advocate, sheriff deputy, clever session. The interesting part here, and what we're talking about tonight, is the historical novelist part. And this was a profession, this was something that didn't really exist widely before Scott, because he was so educated, so he had this this skill. His skill at writing and his his knowledge of history made him the perfect author to sort of invent this idea of a historical novel. And if you know what a historical novel is, basically you take a work of fiction and you set it in a specific point in history where people know about some of the other surrounding events. If you've ever watched or read the series Outlander, you know about historical fiction. We have Sir Walter Scott to thank for that. We also, I'll get to some other things here in a moment here. As we get into things, this is an non-exhaustive list of his works, obviously. Waverley, Old Mortality, Rob Roy, Heart of Midlothian, Bride of Lammermoor, Ivanhoe, is one of his most well-known ones as well, as Marmion and Lady of the Lake. I'm going to put some things up here. The Waverley novels. Now, they're called the Waverley novels because Waverley was the first one, and he published this anonymously. This was an experiment. He was already a pretty well-known author, as well as some of those other professions. And I think the thinking was, well, let's release this anonymously and see how it does and how well it's received. And from there, we'll go on. I guess it's kind of what he decided. He ended up writing, I think it's 28 novels that were released in 42 volumes. Some of them were longer, quite a bit longer. And so when you collect when you do the whole collection, it's quite an investment if you're buying them. I've been searching for these books in places like half-price books in second-hand shops and stuff. And every once in a while, I'll find a really nice hardcover. It's like, oh, I've got to add that to the collection. Waverley, the story of Waverley, just kind of give you a quick rundown of some of these. Waverley itself is set during the Jacobite Rebellion, 1745. You can think that, right? So, restore the Stuart dynasty, we know about this part. Hero is this young Englishman, Edward Waverley. Let's see, I'll read a little of this to you. So Edward Waverley was neglected by his pro-Hanoverian father. Edward is brought up by his elderly uncle, the Jacobite-leaning Sir Everard Waverley. Like Scott himself, Everard reads widely in poetry and romance as a child, creating an imaginary world that he much prefers to the lacklustre present. Having obtained a commission in the army, he's sent to Scotland in 1745. During a spell of leave, he visits his uncle's friend and fellow Jacobite, the Baron Bradwardine at Tullyveolan, forming an attachment to his daughter Rose. The spirit of adventure now leads him to visit the lair of Donald Bean Lean, a Highland freebooter, and the Great Hall at Glenaquoich, home to Fergus MacIver, a young Highland chieftain and an ardent Jacobite. Edward there witnesses a patriarchal society where chieftain and follower feast together, united by ties of kinship. Very flowery and romantic, isn't it? But, Edward's romantic sensibilities are deeply affected by their fanatical enthusiasm for the Jacobite cause, particularly when embodied in Fergus's beautiful sister Flora. The frequentation of known Jacobites compromises Edward, of course, because he's English, right? Compromises Edward with his regiment, leading ultimately to his dismissal and arrest. He's rescued by Rose. Edward joins the Jacobite forces, even though reason tells him that Charles Edward Stuart's attempt to capture the British throne is doomed to failure. He is captivated by the personal charm of the prince, impressed by Flora's devotion, and coerced by the powerful personality of Fergus MacIver. However, when the Jacobite cause fails, Waverley is forced into hiding and is only freed when General Talbot, whose life he has saved at the Battle of Prestonpans, grants him pardon. You might be seeing a few similarities between this and our beloved Outlander series. He grants him a pardon. After attending trial and condemnation of Fergus, Edward is decisively rejected by Flora. He then marries the placid Rose Bradwardine, who represents the rational, realistic presence of post-Union Scotland, as opposed to the colourful, passionate past personified by Flora. The success of Waverley was phenomenal. It established Scott as a novelist, even with an international reputation, except they didn't know who he was. It was published anonymously, yes? But still, regardless, the first edition sold 1,000 copies, which sold out because that was a lot in 1814. So it sold out. That's where I go to. Within 2 days of publication, actually. And by November, a fourth edition was at the presses. The critics, too, were unanimously enthusiastic. The fullest and most perceptive analysis was provided by Francis Jeffrey in the Edinburgh Review. Jeffrey's review, Waverley, cast the whole tribe of ordinary novels into the shade. He said, the secret of the author's success lay in his truth to nature, even the most marvellous parts of his story. Such were his powers of observation and fidelity to actual experience that the reader saw in the novel an instructive exposition of human actions and energies rather than a bewildering series of dreams and exaggerations. The Waverley's faults, deriving from a creaking, hastily constructed plot, were redeemed by the force of its characterization and vividness of its descriptive passages. So, overall, they liked it. Basically, that's the whole point here. There was more praise, and it was so successful that, of course, he went on to write 28 more of it. I mean, that's kind of the way it works, right? You release a movie, it does really, really well at the box office, and the studio comes back and is like, all right, where's the next one? The author. I'm going to go on from there to Ivanhoe. A lot more people have read Ivanhoe than have read Waverley, I think. This one is more of a medieval knight setting kind of thing. So the novel's hero, Wilfred of Ivanhoe, is the son of Cedric, a Saxon nobleman. In hope of one day restoring the Saxon dynasty, Cedric wishes to marry his ward, Rowena, a descendant of Alfred the Great, to Athelstane of Coningsborough, a descendant of Edward the Confessor. Ivanhoe's love for Rowena, however, threatens these plans, leading Cedric to disinherit him. Ivanhoe joins the Third Crusade and, fighting alongside Richard the Lionheart in the Holy Land, wins the king's favour. The novel begins with Ivanhoe's return to England, where Prince John is plotting to depose his brother Richard, who has been taken captive in Austria on his way home from the Crusades. Robin Hood is based on this story, by the way, or it actually shares themes with Robin Hood, in fact. Main theme of the novel is the conflict of honour between chaotic, corrupt rule and peaceful, just rule. Prince John and the Grand Master exemplify corrupt rule. So, let's see, so I guess the Robin Hood version is Prince John and the Sheriff of Nottingham. I almost said Rottingham there, but anyway, whichever one. Yep. Either way, we're going to have a good time. So while King Richard, loyally supported by Ivanhoe, represents the noble hope for the future. So this was a flowery medieval romance based on some truth, but lots of sort of poetical literary license is applied to this. Not going to go through every one of the Waverley novels, but these were kind of some of the interesting ones that I sort of picked to sort of go through. Around this time, by the way, it's curious to note that he was still, if we go back here, let's see, so when he wrote Ivanhoe, it was 1819. He was still, he was a known author. He was very well known, very well respected author. He had political clout. He was also a Freemason at this point, I believe, or very soon after. There's a year in there, but he had quite a bit of pull, because starting the next year in 1820, he was knighted. Walter became Sir Walter, and in 1822, he convinces King George IV to visit Edinburgh. He convinces George IV that he is heir to the Stuart line, the Stuart kings. And I've told this one in another lecture, but George IV was not well liked in general. He was kind of seen as sort of a he was seen as lavish, over the top, not really good at leading, and more concerned with eating than ruling the kingdom. But there's an opportunity there. The king wants to be out, of course, and Scott convinces him, well, I found this, this record of your lineage, and it just so happens that not only are you already king, you're also king by another lineage, and sort of, I don't know if Scott revealed this to him, or if he just chose to use this information to his advantage, and to Scotland's advantage, because in 1822, George IV gets in this grand, this fleet of boats that sails up the coast from London to Edinburgh, and the royal visit, first visit of a ruling monarch to Scotland in over 200 years, in fact, almost 300 years at that point, is George IV. And those of you who know your history, your Claude, after 1745, which is where Waverley happens to take place, the wearing of the tartan is outlawed. Wearing of kilts, the carrying of a claymore, even the playing of bagpipes. However, George IV is coming. The king is coming. The king is not only coming, the king is coming wearing a tartan plaid, wearing a kilt. So it's arranged that all these families that are, all the notable families in Edinburgh and Scotland all over, like, okay, what's my tartan? And some of them had, a history of a certain tartan plaid. Some of them did not. However, you go to a tailor, you go to a weaver, what's the term? The woolery. And you say, what is my family's clan traditional tartan? And this story has been told before up here, but I was going to go back to the tailor, the weaver says, let me just go in the back and I'll open up my book that tells me what your tartan is going to be. And he goes back, he just picks something off the rack and says, this is your family's historic tartan. And there are several Scottish clans whose, don't spread this as a secret, by the way. You lose your Scotland card, you know. But there are several Scottish clans, Highland clans even, that don't have a record of a specific tartan before 1820 or 1822. And so this visit of King George to Edinburgh, that was orchestrated by Sir Walter Scott. Scott, he planned a lot of this. He planned most of it, in fact. Especially the pageantry in Edinburgh. And set this all up because he had his connections in government. He was already well respected in literary circles, and of course it was, if you're a aristocrat, somebody with designs on looking important, being well-read, being intelligent is kind of a thing, right? You want to be seen as an academic sometimes, but not too academic. So there's that strange balance. But he gets this visit to happen, orchestrates the pageantry. There's bagpipes playing to greet George IV in Edinburgh when he gets off the boat. Everybody's wearing their tartans. So let's see. So it was Waverley is titled 60 years hence. So let's see. So that's 6, 7, 8 years. So 68 years hence since the 45. People in Edinburgh are allowed to openly wear their tartans, wear their kilt for the king, because the king is wearing them. So yeah, I guess this is allowed now. And from that point on, we have this tradition of wearing the kilt at formal events. It was worn before that, of course, for centuries, but only in certain occasions. A lot of time it was, we know that it was sometimes almost like a form of camouflage, or it was something that was specific to a region because that's what plants grew there, and that's how you get dyed sometimes. But starting with Scott, this became even more of a national identity. It was a national identity before, but he sort of rebranded Scotland during this time. And so that's where we get these novels. And these novels became so successful in Britain, but also in continental Europe, that news of it traveled to Spain, Germany, and Italy, and even as far afield as Russia. and you have composers writing Scottish music in all these other countries. And so Mauro Giuliani, who wrote a series of 6 Scottish songs, so 6 Scottish airs, gets this inspiration. Another one is Felix Mendelssohn, who he and his parents were great fans of the Waverley novels. But he doesn't know who wrote them yet. Who wrote them yet until 1827. So, let's see here. Oh, there we go, yeah. I didn't change the picture there. Peveril of the Peak. One of the other Waverley novels. Themes of conflict of honour between chaotic... Oh wait, no, this is... No, this isn't one. This one didn't get updated. That's all right. I'll just read it. Peveril of the Peak, another one of these novels, is set around the so-called Popish plot of 1678. Jesuits were alleged to be planning the assassination of King Charles II in order to bring his Roman Catholic brother, the Duke of York, later King James II, to the throne. The story centres on 2 Derbyshire landowners, Sir Geoffrey Peveril, an old cavalier, and Major Ralph Bridgenorth, a Puritan. Despite their differing political and religious opinions, they have been brought together through events connected with the Civil War. So Geoffrey's son, Julian, and Bridgenorth's daughter, Alice, are secretly in love. Their relationship is jeopardized when the Popish plot divides their fathers. Bridgenorth is suspicious of Sir Geoffrey's friendship with the Countess of Derby, who, although guiltless, is implicated in the plot. Julian, who has spent some time attached to the Countess's household in the Isle of Man, returns to England on her service and finds that Bridgenorth has arrested his father as a papist conspirator. He is himself arrested and trying to liberate him, but is freed by his father's retainers. Meanwhile, Alice is entrusted by Bridgenorth to the care of his brother-in-law, Edward Christian, who hatches a plot to make Alice the king's mistress and thus gain access to the royal ear. So this is all like this sort of plot to this royal court intrigue, and it's all about, you know, events that did happen, but again romanticized, made a little bit more flowery and such. So he's kind of taking Scott's kind of taking his cues really from William Shakespeare a little bit, and Shakespeare writes his historic plays like Julius Caesar. You know, the actual history of Julius Caesar is like, okay, there's similarities, but Shakespeare's version of it is, you know, a little more fun to watch on stage. but that's kind of what, you know, Scott takes it. That was you know, poetic. It was a play. Scott takes this and turns it into prose, into you know, full-length novels. Now, Peveril of the Peak, reviewers were divided over, and the Edinburgh Magazine and British Critic were together favourable, the latter declaring that it was better calculated to stand the test of criticism than any other Waverley novel. Other journals, though, such as the European Magazine and Monthly Review, felt it was marred by careless composition and excessive padding. It's like, that's not really how it happened, right? Excessive padding? Now, in my edition of Peveril, this one is a combination of Peveril and Lammermoor. There is, now I'm sure that this is Scott's side of the story, I'm sure, but he printed the conversation that he had with the critic, a correspondence. And he named this critic in the book to, you know, changing the names to protect the maybe not so innocent, who knows. He called him Dry as Dust. So Mr. Dry as Dust, who writes to Scott, craving then your paternal forgiveness. I mean, okay, this is obviously, you know, Scott's flowery, you know, interpretation of what this letter actually said, probably. Craving your paternal forgiveness for my presumption, I only sighed at the possibility of your venturing yourself amongst a body of critics to whom, in the capacity of skillful antiquaries, the investigation of truth is an especial duty, and who may therefore visit with the more severe censure those aberrations which it is so often your pleasure to make from the path of true history. So you're writing these novels about history, but it's not the right history. You know, they're complaining that They're complaining about his historical inaccuracies. One is one might remember a certain movie that came out in the mid-1990s starring Mel Gibson. The movie Braveheart. Last time I was in Scotland, there was a person that I met. Oh, he was a bus driver, and we had a bus driver who liked to talk about Scottish things, I guess, and he was talking about Braveheart because it was on his mind, I guess. And of course, they're like, oh, the history's all wrong. They got the history all wrong. It's like Dryas last year. The history's all wrong, but what it did was it made people curious. And the Scottish Tourism Board has numbers that show tourism to Scotland just skyrocketing after that movie came out. So Dryas, sends in this sort of these questions, and Scott responds. He says, "Odd Zooks." So Odd Zooks. This is Gad Zooks is just another version of that. Odd Zooks. Must one swear to the truth of a song? And that's the Dryas response. Nay, but I fear me that you are here eluding the charge. Men do not seriously accuse you of misrepresenting history, although I assure you I've seen some grave treatises in which it was thought necessary to contradict your assertions. Scott responds, that certainly was to point a discharge of artillery against a wreath of morning mist. Okay, so the point is like discharging artillery against a wreath of morning mist. Okay, so you're shooting nothing here. You're shooting at clouds, at smoke. Dryas goes on. But besides, and especially, it is said that you are in danger of causing history to be neglected. Readers being contented with such frothy and superficial knowledge as they acquire from your works to the effect of inducing them to neglect the severer and more accurate sources of information. Scott responds, I deny the consequence. On the contrary, I rather hope that I have turned the attention of the public on various points which have received elucidation from writers of more learning and research, in consequence of my novels having attached some interest to them. In other words, I got people to think about history because I made it fun. And then they went out and found out, for themselves. They can find out for themselves. I might give instances, but I hate vanity. I hate vanity. He says it twice. He hates vanity. Which we know because he published them anonymously, right? Maybe, I don't know, maybe he did. The history of the divining rod is well known. It is a slight, valueless twig in itself, but indicates by its motion where veins of precious metal are concealed below the earth, which afterwards enrich adventurers by whom they are laboriously and carefully wrought. I claim no more merit for my historical hints, but this is something. So, we need to go on much more from there, but it goes on quite a bit because Scott likes to go on. But that was his correspondence with his critic Dryas. So I don't know how much truth there is to that, but we'll move on here. So I mentioned Felix Mendelssohn. I like talking about this because this brings us out of just Sir Walter Scott, out of Scotland into the wider world, into Western Europe. As I said, the novels, they weren't just a success in Scotland. They weren't even just a success in Britain. They were highly successful in all of Europe. Felix Mendelssohn's parents, and Felix himself, were great fans of Sir Walter Scott. And in 1827, Scott reveals his authorhood. And so, Felix Mendelssohn, who is a respected composer at the age of 20 there, comes to Britain. He makes a trip. It's kind of not so much a pilgrimage. He's just accomplished a lot in his young years, and he's looking for inspiration, and he's grown up with these Waverley novels. And it's big news that the author of Waverley is finally revealed in the personage of Sir Walter Scott, who is also, like I said, already well known for his writing, but also for all of the press that came up around George IV, and because that also made the rounds in the news, and some of those were less than impressed with George IV, but still. Mendelssohn goes to Britain. He starts in London first to meet up with a friend of his, Karl Klingmann. Klingmann is a diplomat stationed in London, and he was to be his trusted traveling companion. So, the first thing they do, now this is 1829 when they're doing this, so it takes a while to make this trip, but they make the trip up to Edinburgh. They probably, most likely went by boat, I think. Mendelssohn is, okay, yeah. So this Karl Klingmann, his traveling companion, they go to Edinburgh, and well, it's they tell two different stories. Klingmann does. So Abbotsford, which is the name of the home of Sir Walter Scott, they go to visit. They're both big fans. So they're fanboying. If you know that word, they didn't use that word, but that's what they were doing. Klingmann writes, "Most astonished friends, oh, most amazed readers, under us the great man is snoring, his dogs are asleep, and his armoured knights awake." His armoured knights, right? "It is 12 o'clock, and the sweetest ghostly hour, which ever I spent, oh, the sweetest hour that e'er I spent, was spent among the lasses." So it's kind of interesting that you should quote that, Burns poem. But the sweetest ghostly hour which I have ever spent, for Miss Scott makes the most delicious marmalade. Right? He writes this long letter that goes on and on. Mendelssohn, at the very end, says, "By the way, this is all Klingmann's invention. We found Sir Walter in the act of leaving Abbotsford, staring at him like fools, drove 80 miles and lost a day for the sake of, at best, 1/2 hour of superficial conversation." So they did actually get to meet with him for a little bit, for about half an hour. "Melrose compensated us but little. We were out of humour with great men, with ourselves, with the world, with everything. It was a bad day." so this poor, this poor young composer, young Mendelssohn, he travels all the way out to Edinburgh from Germany, and he wants to meet this sort of literary hero of his, and finally, so does get to meet him, but it was just, it just sounds like it wasn't all that successful. However, as a result of all that, as a result of these Waverley novels, we have things like this, historical fiction, which, in spite of maybe being a flowery version, in spite of being not the most accurate presentation of history, where sometimes an author will take 2 or 3 different people and combine them into one really big, interesting hero, which is kind of what happened with Braveheart, I think, and a few other of those. But you get these interesting stories, these romanticized versions of history, and some people become great fans of that version of the story, and there's nothing wrong with that. So you can be a fan of the story. I'm a huge fan of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and of course that's pure fiction. But when you love fiction, when you love a story, it can really brighten your life and add a new aspect of this. So when it comes to Waverley novels, when it comes to Ivanhoe, or Robin Hood, which is kind of very similar based on, I think. When it comes to things like Peveril of the Peak and the Heart of Midlothian, which is another one of his various novels. I don't have time to talk about them all, obviously. Has inspired artists, it has inspired sculptors, composers, other writers, other forms of art, to take advantage of the treasure trove of history and the stories that are from history, and then turn them into something else. And even to the point, an author like George R. Martin and the series that, well, the TV series is Game of Thrones, with the Song of Fire and Ice, which features a certain scene that is almost verbatim, at least a version of what happened at I'm spacing on the valley, the McDonald's.
Glencoe.
Thank you, Glencoe. So the massacre of Glencoe. So we can take moments from history and sort of insert them into different forms of art. It gets people interested in. You can have art for art's sake, or you can look at where that art came from and dive into that treasure trove. So after Mendelssohn and his traveling companion left Edinburgh, they travelled on up through Scotland, through the Highlands, and actually got on a boat and visited Fingal's Cave, the Isle of Staffa. Staffa is a tiny island off the west coast of Scotland. It's mostly rock, but the most interesting feature is this maritime cave, which you can go and make over there. I think there's also stairs and a sidewalk and a handrail now because everyone's going to be safe. Although it's not that safe. I've looked at some of the pictures. Like, yeah, if you mess around too much, and fall down and hurt yourself, it's your fault. You're not going to bat an eye. But the story here is Mendelssohn visits this cave, and he goes in and he whistles a tune, and it goes like. And apparently it was a fairly calm day, and the tune echoes back. And he writes it down. You can't see this is his handwriting up there. It's all, everybody struggled at some point, right? But that's in his handwriting. He apparently he scribbled that down, put it in post in mail, and essentially mailed it back to himself, so that it wouldn't get lost on the way, and he came back home and he composed this piece, and I'm going to play that for you. This piece has two titles. It's the Hebrides Overture. It's also called Fingal's Cave. An overture in music is usually something that comes before a production, before an opera or an operetta or whatever. But Mendelssohn was a romanticist, and he didn't care about such details. So the Hebrides Overture is in itself, it's a work in and of itself, and it's sometimes regarded as a tone poem. It kind of sounds a little bit stormy at times. You can imagine the waves crashing against the basalt rock formations. This is my sort of interpretation of this piece. So I call it homage to Hebrides. So as you can see, no matter what I'm talking about, I can always manage to start talking about guitars, even if it's Sir Walter Scott. But because of this novel, there are a lot of things happening. Waverley is even I don't think I can overstate how important that one book is, because as a result of that novel, that publication, we have authors, we have other authors, we have art that came from it too. We also have things like King George IV visiting Scotland. We have this the pageantry of the royal visit that resulted in sort of the rebirth of Scottish culture that was kind of underground and dying for almost 70 years before that whole event. So the Waverley novels are super important, and they're really, it's an enjoyable read. Reading Scott, though, if you want to read Sir Walter Scott, anything by Sir Walter Scott, it's good to look up a few resources, because he didn't write in Scots dialect like Burns did, although he used some dialect when writing character dialogue. He would use some dialect, and depending on what the character was, if it took place in Scotland, he did use some of that. But it can be challenging in other ways, because this is still a work of, this is still a major literary work that was written in Scotland in the early 1800s. So some writing styles and ways of crafting a narrative. He had different ways of approaching that, and he even recommended sometimes, if you have a little trouble getting through something, just read a little bit and then skip a few pages and read something else. He actually recommended skipping back and forth a little bit in some of his novels, which is something that's almost unheard of, in modern novels. Like, oh, you can't go to that chapter, you don't know what's happening. Well, I think his thinking was, since he wrote historical fiction, if you were familiar with the events, you could skip to a part or something like that and see, like, oh, this part of the story is set around the time of this rebellion, or that royal dynasty and all of the intrigue and drama that happened around then. I don't particularly like reading things that way, but it was interesting that he said that you could. Anyway, so that's really my presentation. I encourage you, if you see one of the Waverley novels, I would encourage you to just look up what they are and all of the different titles. Ivanhoe, of course, again, Heart of Midlothian is fantastic. The Talisman is a really interesting story. Peveril of the Peak, and it's all the other works that I can't just Lammermoor, off the top of my head. Go find them; they're great stories. It's a good way to increase your knowledge of history by finding out about Scott's version, and then you can go look up what really happened.